Welcome, everyone, to Great Decisions again. I am going to sign off and turn it over to Jacqueline Karlowski, who is our host for the session. As many of you might know, Jacqueline runs our Dyer Institute for Public Policy, and she's been gracious enough to offer to host the program today. So, Jacqueline, it's all yours.
Thank you, Rick. Appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us again for Great Decisions. I am so happy to have with us today one of our stellar students, Hannah Clay, who will be introducing Dr. Jordan Roberts. We are pleased that he has recently joined the coastal faculty during the pandemic hiring and that period for coastal's history. So Jordan has made a great entrance, and I'm so happy today he's going to be talking about the Quad Alliance, which he'll get into more, but it's interesting to see how this united approach towards thinking collectively to contain China. So I will turn it over now to Hannah in a moment for the introduction, but I do want to remind everyone to please remain muted with your microphones. Sometimes it can pick up a lot of background noise. And also, unlike last week, this week, we're going to go back to the chat box at the bottom of your screen. So if you do have things that come to mind during Dr. Roberts' presentation, go ahead and enter those in the chat, and then I will help moderate the questions at the end. So thank you all for being here, and I want to turn it over now to Hannah.
Hi, my name is Hannah Clay. I'm a student at Coastal Carolina University, and today I'm here to introduce one of our newest beloved professors, Dr. Roberts. Dr. Roberts is an assistant professor of intelligence and security studies at Coastal Carolina University. He previously worked as a fellow at the University of Texas at Austin and holds a doctorate of political science from Duke University. He also holds a Master of Arts from Duke and a bachelor's degree from the University of Utah. He teaches and conducts research in the areas of intelligence, security, and conflict broadly defined. More specifically, much of his research explores covert action and foreign-imposed regime change. His recent publication has been featured in International Interactions, Civil Wars, and the edited volume of The Power of Global Performance Indicators. Take it away, Dr. Roberts.
Awesome. Thank you for that great introduction, Hannah. Thank you to both Dr. Karlowski for hosting the session and Dr. Kilroy for hosting this entire series. I'm excited to get to speak to all of you today about, what might be a very important emerging geopolitical development in a region that we now call the Asia Pacific. Notice, or the Indo-Pacific. Notice that we've, kind of combined these two regions and how we tend to think about them now. So I want to start off with thinking about this new alliance first from the Chinese perspective, instead of from the American perspective. China's most significant security threats and opportunities for expansion in the present are both coming from the sea. The Chinese fear being bottled up in American power by American power projection and American power projection via naval forces, basically keeping them on the Asian continent. This is a primary significant security concern from the Chinese perspective. They maintain claims of ownership to both Taiwan and multiple islands in both the South China and East China Sea, which they believe are claims that are being denied by the international community, especially the United States and our allies. And the Chinese know that they currently lack the power to project into the wider Pacific Ocean, that the US maintains a significant advantage in this theater, largely due to our alliances with countries like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and others. The Chinese basically view this as a coalition that they're going to need to break in order to expand to their full potential, as what they see as a rising power kind of returning to its central role throughout history. Now, if we look at this map, we can start to see some of these issues in the actual geography itself, right? So of course we have China here, but we can see that, these two orange regions on the left side are these disputed territories that China has with India. Note that's going to be important when we talk about the members of the Quad in a moment. But of course, China also claims everything within the South China Sea in this dashed line here, including Taiwan. Many of these countries, the Spratly Islands and others, are also simultaneously claimed by other countries, including Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia. Many different countries have claims in this region. Now, one thing that I would note here, this concern that China has, this fear of being bottled up from their perspective, we can really see this in the geography. If we look at China's coastline, which the vast majority of the Chinese population, by the way, does live near the coastline, we can see that they're hemmed in by the Korean Peninsula from the north, and then Japan, and then these series of islands, including Okinawa, between Japan and Taiwan, and then of course the islands of the Philippines and Malaysia and Indonesia and down into Southeast Asia. This line is something that you might hear referred to as the first island chain. And one of China's premier geostrategic, geopolitical goals in the near term is to ensure that they can project power beyond this first island chain. The concern here is that many of these countries, if we see Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, are US aligned, right? These are countries that are close friends, frequently treaty allies, frequently close trading partners of the United States. And China's concern is that despite the economic growth in military power that they experience, this will operate as a line of containment that hems them in and prevents them from projecting powers overseas and hems them in, preventing them from controlling sea lanes through many of these notable straits that we can see, very small places that much of the world's trade travels through. Now, the reason I want to start off with the Chinese perspective is, of course, we're going to spend most of the time today talking about the American and the Quad perspective. So realizing this is kind of the geopolitical backdrop to what is happening with China and in the Pacific, let's start off with, the basic question here. What is the Quad? Well, the Quad is a shorter way of saying the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which is an attempt by 4 Indo-Pacific powers to contain this spread of Chinese influence, basically to limit Chinese power projection, hopefully within the first island chain, if not the second. Now, this isn't always directly said. In fact, many of these countries go out of their way to avoid directly saying this. Instead, they'll say things such as, the goal of the security dialogue is to promote a free and open Indo-Pacific, right? But of course, you have to ask who is the threat to a free and open Indo-Pacific, and the answer is China, right? So even when China is not directly named, that clearly is the goal of the organization. So who are, as you might guess from the name the Quad, there are going to be 4 countries here. And who are they? It's Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. Excuse me. And so if we are to look at this on the map, we can already start to see the geography and the role that each of these countries is playing. As I showed on the previous map, India has multiple areas of disputed territorial claims with China. And in recent years, there have been bloody border clashes over those claims. Japan obviously is the closest of the 4 Quad nations to China. We're going to see this is going to lead to Japan having played a driving role in bringing about this institution. Australia is a country who has been extremely trade dependent on China in a way that they've realized that they're more vulnerable than they initially intended. We'll talk about some of the history of tariffs there. And of course, the United States is the country that has the largest overall stake in maintaining a free and open trading order in the region of the Pacific. It's one of these things that some people, here on the East Coast might tend to forget, but the United States is a Pacific power. And we have a lot at stake in this region, not just in terms of allies, but in terms of trade and of course, in terms of geography. If there was an adversarial nation with whom we strongly disagreed on values that could project power into the wider Pacific, that would be a security concern for the United States. So all four of these nations share this interest in containing Chinese expansion. So what does the Quad stand for beyond actually, being a shortened term for the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue? Well, they did, in one of the first joint communiques these four countries put out as the Quad, they said that the organization strives for a region that is free, open, inclusive, healthy, anchored by democratic values, and unconstrained by violence, force, threats of force. They've also said that their goal is to facilitate collaboration, especially when it comes to maritime security and meeting the challenges of maintaining a rules-based maritime order in the East and South China Seas. Now, again, this language goes out of its way to avoid saying that our goal is to contain China. But obviously, when we think about who may be the threat to a free, open, and inclusive order anchored by democratic values in the Indo-Pacific, when we think about who is challenging maritime security and the rules-based maritime order when it comes to constructing artificial islands, making territorial claims that many other nations consider to be unfounded, China is the country that is clearly being targeted here, even when, the Quad countries in their official documentation consistently make sure not to say directly that what they're standing against is China. Instead, it's going to be framed as standing up for these sets of values that China is against or poses a threat to. And these values, again, they're democracy, the freedom of navigation. A huge proportion of the world's trade goes through the South or East China Seas. Rule of law when it comes to both law of the sea, when it comes to claiming territories or island, freedom of navigation, again, when we think about trade. But really, fundamentally, this is about containing Chinese power, ideally behind that first island chain. So I've seen a lot of public discourse in which people have speculated that the Quad is an Asian NATO. So is it an Asian NATO? Is it playing the role that NATO played for the United States and Europe in containing the Soviet Union, that this is the Asian version of this? Well, right now, the answer to that is no, but it very well might develop into that. And that potential is what's important. Right now, there is no formal security guarantees being given among these four countries as a group to each other or to other states in the region. Yes, many of these countries have bilateral security guarantees. For example, we have defense treaties with both Japan and Australia. But the Quad as an organization does not have some kind of document the way that NATO does that clearly lays out that an attack against one will be seen as an attack against all and that we will respond in kind. This kind of formal structure of security guarantees does not exist. There's no formal organization. There's no headquarters. There's no Quad specific staff, right? These are all things that may develop as the Quad becomes more institutionalized, but these things don't exist now. And it's important to acknowledge that without these structures, it is not currently in Asia, an Asian NATO. Again, that possibility is very much there. That may be the goal. And in fact, during the Trump administration, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo stated that it was going to be a future goal of the United States to institutionalize the Quad. But we're not there yet. So I do think that some people calling this already intact Asian NATO are jumping the gun a bit on this. But we do see this increasing diplomatic, economic, and military cooperation between these four countries. And this is a sign that we are maybe moving in that direction. And additionally, something that we've seen is that when the Chinese take aggressive actions in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, or on the border with India and the disputed territorial claims, we tend to see countries further embrace this institutionalization. So some amount of whether or not this becomes formalized may be up to China if they engage in more threatening behavior to drive the Quad nations to formalize their cooperation or whether they do not. So where's this presentation going to go from here? I'm going to give a brief history of the Quad and how it developed and in some ways that it's changed over time, and give you guys a couple of the key historical points and moments so there's a good understanding of the timeline. But then I'm actually going to spend most of the time for the talk today talking about these different perspectives on what the Quad is now, what it's doing, and what it might look like in the future. Because to me, the interesting part of the Quad is not the history. The interesting part is the potential in the future. But let's go over this history first. This didn't start as a purely security kind of like containment strategy driven institution. Some of you might remember in 2004, there was a massive earthquake in the Indian Ocean, followed by a tsunami that devastated a lot of South and Southeast Asia. It killed nearly 250,000 people across, I believe, around 14 countries. And this was a massive, unexpected, unpredicted humanitarian disaster. In response to this, 4 countries, these now Quad nations, Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, coordinated what was basically an impromptu joint response of delivering aid, of providing help, of rebuilding in the immediate aftermath, while official institutions and organizations to do this were still being set up. And this joint response was significantly more successful than may have been expected from 4 countries that were not preparing to cooperate on disaster relief or disaster response. And this is what kind of planted the seed of the idea that these 4 countries, 4 liberal democratic states in the Indo-Pacific, could be a group of countries that have a significant potential for future cooperation. This led the Japanese leader Shinzo Abe to recruit the other 3 nations into what was initially a very short-lived Quad. The quadrilateral security dialogue began and ended in about 3 years in the immediate aftermath of this earthquake, and it fell apart in 2007. And, you know, there were a lot of issues here, right? The Japanese and the Australians had a lot of trade ties with China, so they didn't want to push back too hard. India was just not nearly as engaged with the other 3. The US, Japan, and Australia all had already close ties on security issues with each other. This was less true of India, though. And ultimately, first the Australians pulled out during the Rudd prime ministership, and then gradually every country pulled out of trying to make this institution work. However, basically a decade later, Abe, now back in power in Japan after taking a leave for health reasons, he comes back into power as the leader of Japan, and he again spearheads this idea. But the difference is that things have changed in a decade. Once we get to 2017, when it's being revived, we are in a situation where the threat perceived from China and Chinese expansion is much higher from all of these countries. So they're more willing to get together and cooperate and pay real costs to get together and cooperate. Basically, all 4 of these nations were committed the second time around. And this time it really is focused on security first. You know, it's revived specifically because of perceived increased tensions and rising tensions with China. So the Quad holds its first meeting in Manila in the Philippines in 2017. And frankly, it didn't look very promising for cooperation. Some of the countries wanting to be able to issue some kind of joint statement of at least values or goals or intentions after the meeting, but they were unable to agree on basically any language. And so instead, all 4 countries issued their own independent statements that all overlapped in certain ways, but maybe excluded different things that other countries had included as important priorities of the organization. So getting off to a bit of a rocky start there. But 2 years later, in 2019, the first ministerial level meeting of the Quad powers occurs. So this is foreign ministers, our Secretary of State and the foreign minister of the other three countries. And a major thing that comes out of this is that they basically come up with this mantra to advance a free and open Indo-Pacific. And this is basically the slogan of the Quad, and a real representation of the values there, right? That these are democratic states. These are states that wish for transparency, they wish for trade openness, right? This kind of embodies a few of the elements there. And of course, these are all elements that contrast with China and what a Indo-Pacific order under Chinese leadership might look like instead. Now, after this, in 2020, India, who was previously the most reluctant member, the most kind of disconnected from the other three, right? And so, you know, thinking about this from the American perspective, we have a long-term defense and trade relationships with both Japan and China, and less so with India. And India overall was not as integrated into these other countries with Japan or Australia or the United States. So they were the most reluctant member, who were kind of most holding back, I guess, collaboration and cooperation within the Quad. In 2020, they experienced a series of bloody border clashes with China, leaves about 20 Indian troops dead. And the thing about this isn't just that, of course, a border clash like this highlights security tension with China. It's that China has these social media wolf warrior diplomats, right? So these are Chinese diplomatic staff that are, and also just citizens who are on Western social media, which they do not have access to in China, who express very strong nationalistic Chinese sentiment. And very frequently, they can go far enough to ruffle some feathers, right? It's not just patriotism. So for example, I can't remember the exact numbers, but India had 20-something casualties in these border clashes, and China had a single-digit number. And these wolf warrior diplomats on Twitter and elsewhere were mocking the higher rate of deaths among the Indians in these clashes. And these wolf warrior diplomats frequently do this with India in particular. So for example, especially during some of the early part of the Delta wave, India was hit pretty badly by COVID-19. And there were lots of Chinese social media actors mocking the amount of people dying from COVID in India compared to the lower rate in China, also on social media. And so again, excuse me, they are just trying to kind of have this very nationalist pro-China sentiment, but obviously it's going to be pretty offensive and upsetting to you if you are India. And this really begins to push India in a more anti-Chinese direction. India starts to ban a lot of Chinese technology platforms such as TikTok. India begins to erect trade barriers or entirely in trade of certain types of Chinese goods, right? There's real retaliation that is partially driven by the border clash, but is partially driven also by the public outcry at China mocking the deaths of their soldiers, right? That of course, this is perceived as very offensive, and this really gins up public sentiment. And this is where we really start to see a big difference in terms of military cooperation. That at this point, India is now willing to engage in joint naval exercises with all Quad states starting in 2020. India did have joint naval exercises already with the United States and Japan, but not with Australia. And at this point, 2020 is the first year that all four countries conduct naval exercises together. And India is willing to start engaging in that kind of cooperation. Something else that's happening in 2020 is that the Quad starts to have a series of Quad Plus meetings. So this involves representatives, diplomatic staff from the four Quad countries and other countries in the region who may be useful to the Quad nations, who may share the values of helping to contain Chinese expansion. So for example, these Quad Plus meetings include countries like South Korea, New Zealand, Vietnam. And the second ministerial level meetings, so foreign ministers and the Secretary of State from the United States, do meet in Tokyo in 2020, and they continue to draw up further plans for cooperation. After this meeting, after the Tokyo 2020 meeting and the +1 meetings earlier in the year, this is when China starts to really take the Quad seriously. At first, they said that it wouldn't amount to much. They didn't see too many signs of significant cooperation. But what happens here is that China basically decides to look for the weakest link, and they decide it's Australia. This is the smallest economy, it's the smallest population, it's the smallest in terms of a security threat to China. So it's the country that China feels like they can go after in the Quad as a weak link. And so they go after Australia with extremely aggressive tariffs. China is the primary export market for Australia. So this is really going to hurt. A lot of trade restrictions on everything from raw materials to wine to everything else. And of course, this really just pushes the Australians to realize that their trade dependency with China may actually be a liability, and just pushes them even further into embracing the Quad. And this is the pattern that we see again and again, right? That China has these border clashes with India. It then, allows the wolf warrior diplomats to insult the honor of the Indian troops on social media. That China just kind of keeps pushing these countries that are maybe a bit more reluctant into further embracing the institution of the Quad, instead of, trying to tamper down fears. This eventually culminates in 2021, where we got the first leader level summit of the Quad leaders in Washington. Here is a image there. There's President Biden hosting the leaders of Australia, India, and Japan. And this is pretty significant in terms of this being the first in-person leader level meeting among all four of these leaders. There's some speculation that it could have happened earlier if not for COVID. But this is when it ultimately happens. And of course, that is a big symbolic signal of unity and future cooperation. So let's talk about the perspectives on the Quad for a minute. I want to start with the perspectives coming from each of these member states. Why are each of them invested in this security dialogue, in this potential avenue for cooperation? So when it comes to Australia, the tariffs and the dependency concerns on Chinese trade have really pushed them in this direction. They haven't just suffered Chinese tariffs after the Tokyo 2020 meeting. They also suffered pretty extreme Chinese tariffs after they banned Huawei's 5G network from being established in Australia. Of course, 5G, for smartphone connectivity, because there was real concerns about it being used in intelligence collection. And of course, Australia has a lot of intelligence cooperation with the other Five Eyes nations, including the United States. And there's a lot of pressure to not allow basically Chinese communication infrastructure to be built in the country. And of course, once they said that they would not go with a Chinese company to build their network, China engaged in a lot of damaging trade practices towards Australia. We can also see that Australia overall is really trying to amp up its defensive capabilities and what it can contribute to alliances in the Pacific. So at the same time that all of this Quad expansion is happening, Australia also signs the AUKUS deal, which stands for Australia, United Kingdom, United States, between these three countries. And this is an agreement where, among other things, the most kind of notable central piece of the agreement is that we and the British are going to share our nuclear submarine technology with the Australians, allowing them to build much more sophisticated, less detectable, longer operating submarines for use in the Indo-Pacific. Notably, China does not currently have great anti-submarine capabilities. And this is a big deal for Australia to do, because it involves scrapping a $90 billion French deal that they had made for conventional submarine technology from France. And this is something that creates a pretty big rift between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, and France and many other EU countries on the other hand. I think shows that not just Australia is willing to ruffle some feathers with traditional allies, but the United States and the UK are as well. That we are willing to, for example, incur the wrath of the French or the Germans or other partners in Europe in order to greater invest in the Indo-Pacific, which is not something that we have done historically in terms of regional priorities. The Pacific has been kind of the future priority for a long time, but maybe we're seeing the real shift where we're really willing to prioritize relationships in that theater. India. We've talked about these territorial disputes. India is the one Quad member who actually has a land border with China, and it's a contentious land border. And of the countries that have territorial disputes with China, India is the one who has the most substantial disputes that are not about islands, right? And of course, amphibious assaults are much more difficult than slight border incursions. And so India has these kind of immediate concerns of lower stakes fighting with China. India also sees itself as the rising power of Asia. I mean, China is the world's most populous country right now. India is the second most populous. And because of the one-child policy and other reasons, it's very much expected that India will surpass China in population in the near future and will become a political and eventually economic and military power in Asia. And so India has these concerns that they may be China's primary rival on the Asian continent, and they're trying to look ahead and ensure that they have partners who are not on the Asian continent who can help them with that endeavor of competing to be the dominant power in Asia. Japan's perspective is one of historical enmity between the nations. Obviously, a lot of atrocities were committed by the Japanese in China in World War II. Obviously, these two countries are geographically close to each other. They have historical, cultural ties. They view themselves as kind of on the front lines of potential Chinese expansion, whether that's literal territorial expansion or more of sphere of influence expansion. And again, they kind of view themselves, if we think back to that, I think it was the second map I put up. I mean, they're right there in that first island chain that China would want to find a way to break through. And of course, this means that Japan has a vested stake in containing China to whatever degree they possibly can. And then, of course, the United States. Our primary goal here, being a bit more geographically separated, is still the containment of China. Basically, there are a series of individuals in government, in the media, in the academy, thinking about this as a partial replay of the strategy from the Cold War with the Soviet Union, where the goal was to contain communism to the Soviet Union and to specifically draw a hard line across the European continent. Much the same way, many American strategists today are thinking about drawing that line in the Pacific at one of these island chains. Where is the limit to where we would allow the Chinese to expand and where would we not allow that? And additionally, of course, there is a, international liberal rules-based trading order that the United States has built, propped up, supported, and benefited from since 1945. This is an order that supports American values. It supports American security interests. It supports American economic interests. And this is an order that the United States views China as probably the largest threat to. It's the most significant country that does not share those values. And this creates a strong incentive for the United States to find local partners in Asia, like Australia, India, and Japan, to find a way to ensure that that region does remain supportive of American values to whatever degree is possible given Chinese rising power. And again, yeah, those values, democracy, open trade, rule of law. Something that I do want to highlight that is an important perspective here is that, I think that, the immediate focus when we talk about the Quad is going to be on the security side. It's going to be on the defense side. But the Quad is not just power containment, draw a geopolitical line in the sand approach. For example, they have emphasized the use of soft power, and the most significant version of this so far is the vaccine program. In March of last year, almost a year ago, the Quad nations came together and agreed to cooperate on distributing 1 billion COVID-19 vaccines to other states in the Indo-Pacific, right? Basically a goodwill campaign to show these states that these 4 countries are deeply engaged in the region. They're generous, they're capable, right? In some ways, this looks again like what the Quad looked like at the start when it was engaged in disaster response, right? Trying to show that they can have a form of responsible leadership over this region with a model that works, a model that can be competition to a model that just involves cooperation with China. And of course, this is because the Chinese were already engaged in this kind of vaccine diplomacy, giving vaccines to countries in the region, right? So this is a way of trying to compete for that goodwill with China. So I do want to highlight that this isn't all about ships and drawing lines. This is also about kind of winning the hearts and minds of people in the region. Now, one thing that is interesting here is the idea of expanding Quad membership. I mean, obviously we can't call it the Quad. We're going to have to call it the Quint if there are 5 and so on if it continues to grow. But if this becomes institutionalized, will it really only be these 4 states? And if these 4 states want to be successful, that probably can't be the case. So who are other potential members of this kind of coalition? One option is to look for members within the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is the local regional body of cooperation among countries in Southeast Asia. And this could be that the bloc is allowed to somehow participate in the Quad as a bloc. It could be that there are +1s to different member states on a rotating basis at all Quad meetings. For example, potential states there might include Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia. A lot of these states in Southeast Asia have competing claims with China when it comes to islands in the South China Sea. So they do have a vested stake here. Generally, most of these nations have attempted to remain neutral in competition between the Quad nations and China in Asia, which does play to their interest because they don't want to feel threatened or in an adversarial relationship with either side. But given that how many of them have competing territorial claims with China, there's a real opportunity for Quad expansion here. But there's another opportunity that I think is a bit more promising, and that's South Korea as the potential 5th member of this dialogue. Now, this is actually coming up in the very near future here. On March 9th, South Koreans are going to the polls on their presidential election. The current president is from the more liberal of the mainstream South Korean parties, but the conservative challenger has openly said that South Korea should seek to join the Quad, not just participate in these Quad +1 meetings like South Korea has done before, but that South Korea should attempt, because of its relatively large economy and population, its proximity to China, should attempt to actually become a potential 5th member of the Quad. So this is a real foreign policy difference that may affect the foreign policy strategy of the United States that will come out of these South Korean elections next month. And this is something that we would need to look at very carefully. How we decide, if we decide to expand the Quad into 1, some kind of formal institution, and 2, an institution that includes more than just these 4 members. Because, for example, if you've heard any of the rhetoric coming out of Russia with the current Ukraine crisis, expanding alliances, even defensive alliances, in ways that encircle adversaries, tend to make them feel threatened and willing to escalate because they feel that time is not on their side. So whether or not and to what degree we should expand the Quad is very much an open question. But I think here that South Korea, depending on the result of this presidential election next month, may be the real test of this, of a nation that could potentially be brought in. Now, the final thing that I want to get to here, and I'm going a bit off topic, but I think we can't ignore the fact that we have a massive crisis and a potential land war in Europe, the largest since World War II, just around the corner here over Ukraine with potential Russian aggression. I want to ask the question, think about for a moment, what this has to do with the Quad. And I do think there's an issue here of whether or not in Europe and in other theaters than the Asia Pacific, the United States should be demonstrating resolve to show that we are willing to stand up for our values, to better buttress those values in the Indo-Pacific, or whether we need to engage in restraint in those regions to basically save effort and resources, scarce resources, for use in the Indo-Pacific. So I think on one side of this debate is the resolve perspective. This is the idea that we must maintain our reputation for resolve in the face of foreign aggression. So for example, we need to strongly commit to deterring, if that's even still possible, or punishing Russian aggression in Ukraine. And that if we do not respond with sufficient strength on the issue of Ukraine, then China may feel emboldened to take military action against, for example, Taiwan as the most likely target. So the logic behind this perspective is that the United States has a reputation for standing for these values of free and open international orders, of democracy, of self-determination. And if we don't stand up for those values, even in a separate region, such as Eastern Europe, if we don't stand up for these values in Ukraine, we may find ourselves in a position where China feels emboldened. They say, look, the United States was not willing to intervene sufficiently in Ukraine to stop Russia. This means that the United States and maybe the other Quad nations are not really willing to intervene to stop us from taking Taiwan or asserting other claims either in the South China Sea or along the first island chain. The other side of this, though, the other perspective is the restraint perspective. The idea that the United States has scarce resources in terms of military assets and budgets, and that we can't overcommit in other regions if we want to keep our powder dry for deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. That if we overcommit, for example, in our response to Russian aggression in Ukraine, that we may exhaust either the resources themselves or the public will of Americans to stand up for faraway foreign lands, and that we might not have enough of those resources or enough of that public will left when China makes a similar challenge in the Pacific. And that we actually have to choose. We have to choose our battles very carefully. And I think this is a really significant, thorny, difficult debate that the United States needs to try to resolve. Because obviously, if you embrace what I'm calling here, the resolve perspective, and you're wrong, what you will have done is overcommitted yourself to defending lots of separate regions. And ultimately, what decides which ones you're able to defend is the sequence of aggression and not your actual priorities, right? That you've not managed to save scarce resources for the higher priority regions, which the Biden administration has stated that the Indo-Pacific is the higher priority for them. If you choose the restraint perspective and you are wrong, then maybe what you do is you say, I'm going to conserve American resources for the fights that matter more, and I'm going to save those resources for competition with China, who is the bigger threat than Russia, and you allow Russia to walk into Ukraine with insufficient consequences. And the cost that you may pay is that this may embolden China. It may create an effect similar to essentially giving concessions to China, to something like appeasement. It may be perceived in that way. The United States is weak. They're not willing to stand up for these values. They've made all kinds of commitments in the Indo-Pacific, but we've got no reason to believe that they will keep them. And then the Chinese would be emboldened to move into challenge and at least make an attempt. So I really think that, and this is my attempt, of course, to tie this talk into the current event of the day. But I do think this is an important question and something that should be on the back of President Biden and other policymakers' minds as they decide what to do in Ukraine. That, of course, Ukraine isn't just an isolated country. It exists on the globe with every other country and every other commitment that we have. And we have to decide about what our behavior there might mean for future behavior or future crises that we could face in the Indo-Pacific. I will note that an interesting wrinkle of this is that India does have pretty strong historical cooperation with Russia. And they do buy some of their weapon systems from the Russians. But the Indians here have been critical of the territorial claims that Russia has made in Ukraine, even though they may be kind of like this sphere of influence idea that the Russians promote, because India would maybe like to have a sphere of influence of their own in South Asia. So we can also see that once we start to broaden the geopolitical perspective outside of the Indo-Pacific, these four countries don't always agree on everything. They basically agree on the Indo-Pacific region and on the containment of China. But now, once we look to the Ukraine crisis, for example, the US and Australia and Japan are all clearly very strongly on one side of this crisis. India has made statements that are in alignment with opposing Russian aggression there, but not nearly as strongly. And so that is something to highlight, that as these issues become more globalized, maybe connections are drawn, that this could be a point of fracture in the Quad as well. All right, so I think I will go ahead and end there in terms of the prepared presentation content, and leave time open for questioning here, because I'm anticipating that there could be a lot of really good questions about the future that I and nobody can answer maybe, but are still worth kind of speculating on and thinking about. So I'll open it up to Jacqueline, who I believe is taking the questions.
Thanks, Dr. Roberts, so much. We do have a few questions that have come in during our conversation. And for everyone still viewing, feel free to continue to add more questions in the chat as we move through this Q&A time. So the first question that came up actually was about how the goals of the Quad differ from the goals of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TTP.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. So for those who may not remember very well, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a trade agreement that was being negotiated by the Obama administration with the majority of significant East Asian and Southeast Asian economies other than China, basically creating a trade zone, a free trade zone between the United States and all of the Asian nations other than China. So clearly this was an attempt by the United States to tie itself more economically to this region, to help these countries not fall into a Chinese trade orbit. And so first of all, in terms of different goals, this is primarily an idea of containing the economic expansion of China versus the military expansion. But I'd also highlight what ultimately happened to the TP, which is that while in the 2016 presidential election, candidate Clinton wanted to continue on the path of the TPP, candidate Trump did not. Trump ultimately wins this election, and the United States pulls out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So instead, what now exists is something called the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership instead, which is actually less comprehensive because it did not include the United States. But with the rest of these nations. And this basically means that there's greater economic integration among countries other than China in the region, which still may serve as a buffer to Chinese economic expansion. But something that I would highlight that has happened recently is that, of course, countries that are not party to the TPP can apply to join, and there is an ascension process. And after some recent Chinese military maneuvers towards Taiwan, both China and Taiwan each applied in the same week to join the TPP. And of course, because of the fact that China does not recognize Taiwan as a separate country, and most countries in the regions do not either, they embrace the one China policy, both of these countries could not be allowed entry into the TPP. If China is allowed entry, which it is the larger market, it would create more economic gains for all the other states. This institution and negotiation that we worked very hard on under the Obama years will essentially be inherited by the Chinese as a trade network. And so it would be the worst of all possible worlds. I mean, to get back to the original question, the initial goals were different in terms of economic versus security containment. But there's a very real chance that TTP could be basically co-opted by China if they're allowed entry. So we will have to see what happens with that process. But I would not be banking on the TTP as a way of containing China at this point.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was a great question and answer. The next question is actually about CETO, whatever happened to CETO. And I had to quickly Google this because it's been a long time since I've thought of this. It's the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization from 1954.
Honestly, I don't know. I can't give you a lot of feedback on looking back that far. Sorry, that's not something I can really speak to that much detail on.
No, I had to look it up myself here quickly online. It'd be interesting to sort of look at a historical perspective of the region, perhaps more historical at a different time. Okay, the next question is, all four members of the Quad are also spacefaring nations. How do you think that may band together to counter potential Chinese aggression in that domain?
That is an interesting question. I will say that each of these countries has different types of space capabilities. I know, for example, that both India and the United States are developing anti-satellite weaponry. And as far as I know, neither Japan or Australia are. So there may be some differences in the degree of commitment to space policy there. I would say that, of course, there's a huge amount of potential for cooperation there. And one thing that I would say, specifically with India, is they've recently opened basically their space market to outside private actors. So you can think about something like seeing someone like an Elon Musk working there as well, which creates a possibility of these private spacefaring actors operating across countries. We could see some operating in the United States and India because they've recently opened themselves up to that opportunity. What exactly they could do in terms of deterring Chinese space aggression, I'm not sure. The issue is that fighting any kind of warfare in space and low orbit is a serious problem. Destroying any satellites in this area could be a potential threat to all satellites, as debris will be circling the Earth at a very high velocity, potentially knocking out GPS and other important satellites. I would have to do some thinking about what specifically could be done with regards to deterrence in space. I do think all these countries could contribute. I think the US and India maybe more so than the other two, because the US and India are investing more in space at the time.
Right. And that's a great topic, actually, because that leads into our discussion next week, which is our final week for the Great Decisions lecture series. So we can all tune in next week for that. Our next question is actually about the UN and why there's no mention of the UN. Enough countries have concerns to warrant the inclusion of UN as a body for this discussion.
Sure. So the UN, to be included in what way? If what we're thinking about here is containing Chinese expansion, well, of course, the issue is that China is one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and maintains a veto over anything that goes through the UN. So if the thought here is that the UN could be an alternative way to contain Chinese expansion, the issue there is that the Chinese are going to have a veto over anything going through the UN Security Council. That said, of course, there are a lot of opportunities for the UN to get involved in a lot of the things that the Quad are doing, especially if we think about some of those soft power things like the vaccine diplomacy, this kind of thing, or a space where I could see the UN coming in and being a more multinational, inclusive actor for the region, possibly than the Quad or China. But again, China's, and of course, the United States is a permanent member of the Security Council as well. With both of these countries having vetoes, anything that is contentious between them is not getting through the UN Security Council, unfortunately.
Great. We have a question here about the current status of China installing a missile systems guidance since the South China Sea. I guess that was maybe brought up last year at Great Decisions talk with one of our professors, installing a missile system of some sort in the South China Sea.
Yeah, I am not fully up to date on the progress on all of these installations that are being built on the different actual islands and artificial islands in the South China Sea. But what this question is getting at is that on many of these small islands, some of which are really just kind of an outcropping of rocks more than they are an island, and do not meet the definition of an island under the laws of the sea, and therefore are not subject to being claimed as territory in this way. But China does this anyway, and often builds out the islands to meet the definition of size. Yeah, China has begun building defensive missile installations on some of these islands. I also know they have been building runways for aircraft as well. And these are serious concerns. I'm not sure how operational the furthest along versions of these are right now, but it is something that is not recognized by the vast majority of the international community as being a legitimate claim. So this would be an example of the Chinese, again, kind of flouting international law in order to kind of expand their defense and security perimeter.
Great. Thank you so much for everything. Are there any other final questions? If not, we will wrap up here. And I wanted to also, because we mentioned space, to kind of, again, plug our program for next week, same place, same time. And it's going to be interesting to see what the race for space looks like in the 21st century. I think that would be an interesting and relevant topic for everyone. So I'm seeing no more messages coming into the chat. I want to thank you again, Dr. Roberts, for your time, and thank you for all of your attention and participation. And we will see you next week. Thank you all so much.
All right. Thank you. Everyone have a great weekend.